about things that can be done now for your organization, your event planning, event registration, association registration, websites, things like that. So we can take advantage of what for some is a slower time, for some is a time of pivoting, and for others is a very, very busy time. But I wanted to be kind of respectful of all of those different things. Um, so, great. So it's about 3 minutes after. And let me see if I can successfully share my PowerPoint. That's always the scary part. Okay, great. All right, perfect. Let me get the chat box open. Great. Oh, it disappeared. There it is. I used to be so proficient at Zoom, and then everybody and their dog started using Zoom. And by doing that, what ended up happening is that there's all these new bells and whistles now. So good morning, everyone. I really appreciate you being here. I thought I would do kind of a brief introduction and kind of a layout of what to expect from this kind of Zoom setup, what we're going to be doing today. Other people will be joining in, and you're welcome to leave early, do what you need to do. I'm excited to be able to work with you. If you're interested in the chat, you're welcome to put your name, put your role, where you're from, just to kind of let other attendees know where you're at, and we'll go from there. I originally created this particular program that we're going to be going through today, primarily talking about in-person events for obvious reasons, but I have a background as an event planner, but it was much more like festivals and marches and things like this. Although when I worked in student affairs as a college administrator, I also did social and educational programming and any of my volunteer work with either my sorority or other fraternities and sororities. Thought that I really actually had a pretty good amount of event planning, meeting planning kind of experiences. When I opened my own speaking and consulting business, I got more and more involved in an association and corporate level and learned about different suppliers and different vendors and meeting professional roles and expectations. And I was actually invited to MPI's intensive on diversity a couple of years ago, and did a deep dive in the study that MPI did with NYU on what kind of inclusion meeting professionals are doing, vendors and suppliers as well, what they are doing, what they aren't doing, and how people kind of feel. And my takeaway from that was, I wasn't expecting this, but my takeaway was kind of this Venn diagram of a bunch of free to very cheap things that you can do to create a more inclusive event that isn't about the law. And so I know, like Joan, who's on and is an attendee in the webinar, does a lot of work specifically around ADA, and I think that's amazing and it's really important work. So just to set expectations, what I'm really talking about are free to cheap things that you can do right now that mostly are about asking questions and then doing something with the answers from those particular questions. So just to be clear as well, if you have any thoughts or comments as we move along, please feel free to send any text messages to 202-670-4262. Now or even later, I'm happy to answer any questions or give kind of one-on-one advice about particular situations that you might be having. You can always drop me an email as well. I am a preferred provider with the Events Industry Council, and for those of you that are interested in either renewing or working towards your CMP, there's a survey link at the very last slide that you can fill out, and I will turn in all of your information to the EIC to get your CMP credits, because I know that's kind of hard to be doing right now. Those of you that don't need CMP credits but are interested in more information and or the slides or something like that, I will also be emailing those out as well. So if we're going to be talking about inclusion beyond the law, then it is important to talk about managing risk and being able to understand how you could be excluding someone without even really consciously knowing about it. It's also important, and this is what I mean by free to cheap, is that you already have existing tools and resources, and you already have practices that you can use during budget freezes, during hiring freezes. And what I wanted to do is put together a group, a long group of information or ideas to kind of get you thinking about what you can possibly do that is free to cheap. And the hardest part will probably be developing new questions to address the invisible needs that you may not even know about. Again, for those of you that are interested in the CMP, this one is approved for Domain C on risk management, and I'm happy to help. So, as I said, when I kind of started working with associations and organizations, I felt like the question that was first being asked is, what can meetings and convention industry professionals do to be even more inclusive in ways that are often inexpensive? And what I found is that if we started with this question, what ends up happening is we kind of get wrapped around the axle because we don't necessarily know what we can do to be more inclusive, because we don't actually even really know what we're doing currently that is inclusive, because we don't actually really know what's being excluded. And the first step of doing inclusion work is to acknowledge that you have to exclude some people, and some people it's on purpose, because they're not paying members, or because they didn't have a name badge, or they didn't register. That's what I mean by excluding people on purpose. Maybe the event is only open to members, or those kind of expectations I think are really important. So what I wanted to do was to, if we flipped this question to virtual, then we also need to know what are some inexpensive things that we can be doing to be more inclusive. Who are we excluding when we actually start thinking about our virtual events as well? So I'm trying to do this original presentation that's also a hybrid about virtual, because I know in the lay of the land that we currently have, a lot of people are pivoting to virtual, and it doesn't mean just opening a Zoom account. It's actually something you really need to be conscious of. A better question that I think to ask is about whether or not you are including the people you are trying to include. Are you excluding the people that you are intending to exclude? And who are you including that you didn't mean to? And who are you excluding that you didn't mean to? Because the ultimate answer here, and this is my biggest takeaway from the study that MPI did, is that there is a gap between our intentions and our application. So a lot of people are trying really hard to be very inclusive, but they don't necessarily know how. Or more importantly, there's a third kind of character. So maybe it's the client or the organization or the hotel or a supplier. So you want to do it, but you can't because this triangulation thing that happens around application. So I think it's a really important piece to be able to understand that the greatest commonality I have found in my diversity work over the last 20 years is the gap between intention and application is what actually stifles our ability to be self-reflective and look at what we could do with the resources that we already have, even if budgets are frozen or pulled or hiring freezes or a global pandemic is happening, we're quarantined, we're sheltering in place, and the world is on fire. The gap between intentions and applications is actually what I want to focus on, not the intentions and not the applications so much, but this gap. And if we can have a better understanding of how to determine and define and look at and analyze the gap, then the applications will be able to kind of show themselves, because I'm making an assumption that everyone's intentions are to be as inclusive as possible. So I also need to clarify what I mean by participant and professional. So participant can be members, clients, users, audience members, those of you that are attendees right now on this webinar. Participants can also be people who Zoom bomb you, or if you're Facebook living, that you're like, who are you and why are you making comments on this event? If we're talking about live events, they're community members or people in the area who enter the space because they're looking for directions or they need to go to the bathroom. So when I say participant, I might even use the word users, right? And they may be your intended target, and they may be some extra people. When I say professionals, I also want to broaden that out to meeting planners, vendors, suppliers, sponsors, people who are in the vendor hall, people who are working at the hotel or the convention center. if you are using a moderated like WebEx or an AV team to kind of host a virtual meeting, now you have the AV team and the people in the background who are doing different kinds of work. So that's what I'm going to mean by participant and what I'm going to mean by professionals. So there are meta conferences, right? There's conferences that are for the professionals that are actually a participant at this particular event. That's fine. We can go back and forth, but I want to make sure that we are able to kind of do a clear understanding of what I mean by those two. So, um, this is a good one. So, when I was renewing my dues with the EIC as a preferred provider, this is just an example, and I gave them this feedback already. So one of the most common mistakes on applications or websites or forms, etc., is people ask for gender, and then the answers are female and male. Female and male is a sex-based binary, and gender actually means more like man or woman or masculine or feminine. So because we know that sex is not something we're supposed to be asking anymore, our intentions are to be inclusive. But what ends up happening is the application is that you're asking for something and the answers are not that thing. So what I would recommend is you either ask for sex and the answers be male or female, or even better, put female first because male almost always comes first. Or if you're asking for gender, you can ask for man or woman, and or have a blank line for other people to fill in whether they're gender non-binary or if they identify as trans. They'll be able to self-identify. So that's a good example of intentions, but the application, there's a gap. Same thing is on the renewal form, it asked if I had anything to do with healthcare. Well, kind of. I am a patient and I speak to healthcare, but I don't really know what this means. So the context, because I didn't know the context, I assume it doesn't mean me, but that's another intention versus application. So if there's a little bit more information about what do you mean, are you healthcare, so that the user or the participant in this form can be like, oh yeah, that's totally not me, that might be helpful. When it asks for other designations, CMP is one of the main designations that happens within the EIC, but there's also training and facilitation, etc. I'm a certified speaking professional, that's not a choice. Is there a way that I can add that in? Or are you intentionally not including certified speaking professionals because we're kind of weird vendor kind of offshoots? Don't know. But those are really great conversations to use as an example of who you might be excluding. I think our kind of deep dive in diversity trainings often teach us that we're never supposed to exclude anyone. But the reality is you don't have enough space. Like my Zoom platform only holds 500 people. So I have to pick which 500 people am I trying to target, which means I'm excluding the 501st person. So if you can have clear identified intentional targets of who you are including, but also clear guidelines of who you are going to exclude from this event, then inside of there, you've now defined the group of people that you're going to try to include so that you can work on the gap of application. So it seems really easy, but we have to start there. Because we're not really meeting in person, even though some states are actually going to roll out some kind of hybrid models relatively soon from what I've heard. I'm going to be talking about live and virtual. I know for some, it's still a really hard wound to talk about the lack of in-person meetings, and events that we really care about have gotten canceled. My business was decimated in about an hour and a half, and I've done virtual programs for decades. But the truth is that my virtual programs that I've done for decades, I didn't have to pivot to do something new. And some of my virtual contracts also canceled because of either the prioritization of diversity or furloughs or budgets got pulled, etc. So it's a very complicated time, and I want to try to address that reality. So I'll be kind of flipping back and forth because I want to be able to provide you the most information I can, and I don't know where everyone is around what kind of aspects or questions they might be asking within their work or their organization. That enables me to be more inclusive. See what I did there? Okay, great. So outside of ADA, and I already mentioned that ADA is not a specialty. I am not a lawyer. I was a ceramics major. So what I think is important, though, is that if you notice that US-based laws, whether we're talking about federal or state, they evolve and change, ebb and flow. even if you look at the legislation specific to ADA, for those of you that are wondering, um, how ADA has been implemented is really subpar to expectations. And this is pre-COVID. There's tons of work that needs to be done around inclusion and asking questions and responding appropriately to that. So what I want to be able to do is to showcase best practices, but teach the skill of noticing when you can be inclusive, whether we're talking about virtual or in person. Now, some of you have events that travel state to state or are in different places, or maybe you're doing a virtual event where you have people coming in from all different kinds of states. You also may very well be an event that stays in the same place. But because state laws vary and change, you kind of need to do research. You need to Google and find out what states your participants are from so that you can know what their expectations are of what is good or bad practice by state. But you also need to be able to do research about where you might be heading or what you might be looking into. Federal laws also ebb and flow and also differ country to country. So, just for a global perspective, if you have participants or professionals coming in from other countries, they may also have very different expectations. Just as an example that I like to use, when on Zoom, or as some of you have been chatting, some of you have voluntarily been using your pronouns so that other people would know what pronouns you use. And some places where we live, that is a common practice that you would say, just pet it. I use she, her, hers pronouns. And then you would move along. And there's other places where that's not a common practice. So then people may have some questions about, what is this? What's going on? Why is there a grammar quiz? So you need to be able to know what your participants and the professionals at the particular event are used to. I find that if you ask in the middle of the event, then you immediately find out who's ready and who's not ready, and that's a difference, right? But if you can ask in advance, then you can actually prepare people to come in. So on my registration form for this particular event, I didn't have what are your preferred pronouns as an option. Because of Zoom, you can rename yourself if you wanted to, but I have it, the participants locked down, for lack of better words, because I had so much content I wanted to make sure that I could get through everything. Uh, I don't have that included, but I made that choice, and I made the choice because of some other parameters that I was looking into. So even if it's a best practice in some place, it can be very off-putting in other places because they don't know what it is. So how are you bridging that gap? Again, the theme. So to start off, and some of you, this may be super basic and you are more advanced class. So this is just how I explain this when people are relatively new to this process. So based on federal protections in the United States, there's a group that is called the Big Eight. There are tons of other social identifiers, but the Big Eight are the one that come up the most common in federal or state legislation. So ability is usually referred to as only physical access. However, emotional and mental capabilities are also starting to be acknowledged within ADA. Food, allergy, beverages, noise, light, those kind of things are starting to fall into an ability kind of concept around the social identity of what one is temporarily able to do. Age, depending on your organization or your event, there is often a too old or a too young for that event, or even just for the stereotype of that particular profession. So when we talk about ageism or something, age usually comes up from there. Is also the case that ethnicity, which often gets compounded to race. Ethnicity often is cultural based, so it might be someone's identity, it might also be some practices that they are doing. Whereas race usually is perceived or identified visibly about someone who either is white or not white. Um, Socioeconomic class status is around how much money someone is perceived to be making or have access to in the particular moment. Um, Religion, political beliefs. There are times where there are assumptions of people's religion or political beliefs that then silence other people's religion and political beliefs, whether we're talking about holidays or specific political issues, or I tend to talk about controversial issues. So where are people's political beliefs coming in from? Gender, We talked a little bit about that with the EIC registration forms. Can be someone's perception of gender, their gender roles, their gender identity, their gender expression, whether it's on a binary of masculine or feminine, or gender nonconforming or androgynous. And then sexual orientation usually refers to heterosexuality or straight people, as well as gay, lesbian, bisexual, etc. So just to kind of review the big eight of where we're starting from, for some, this is kind of a new way of looking at it, and for others, it's not. So just checking in on the chat. Joan, I am getting the Q&A and I have my text number. I'm just trying to get through some of the basic slides, and then I'll take a pause and look for questions. So hopefully that helps. But again, the texting number is 202-670-4262, and that'll go to my Google Voice number on my phone. You're also welcome to use the chat, which I'm reading, and also the Q&A, which I'll get to when I pause for questions. So thanks, Joan, for the reminder. Okay, so if federal and state legislation is kind of the starting place, let's say with like sexual orientation as well as gender identity and expression, there's still a long, long way to go. And depending on which political administration is present on a state, a local municipality, county, federal level, and based on the country and the culture of those particular understandings can change wildly. So to use some examples of the big eights, and I wanted to kind of put this in a virtual context, when you're thinking about ability, you need to be thinking about people's ability to focus, whether they have a quiet space, what kind of attention span the users or the participants that you're targeting are going to have. Will there be distractions? You may have noticed 24 minutes ago the mail came because I have 3 80-pound dogs and there's nothing I can really do about that. Maybe one of the bonuses that come out of us having so many Zoom meetings is that we become a little bit more patient with the lack of perfection of sound and disruptions. But there are also people who have very distracting living situations, and so just showing their video or something like that isn't necessarily plausible. Being able to type, reading lips with people wearing masks, it's very, very challenging for people to read lips, obviously, if half their face is covered. I did a program the other day with ASL interpreters, and they also talked about how if you're wearing sunglasses and a mask, then all of the grammar that shows up in ASL shows up in your shoulders, your eyebrows, your whole face, and those could be blocked off by sunglasses and masks. That's even if you're on a virtual event. And then whether or not you are able to hear, I thought it was quite interesting thinking when I was working with deaf interpreters that the idea of muting the buttons so that you can't hear all the other sounds, if they can't hear the other sounds, then they have to be told to mute possibly. Age, looking at tech familiarity, I actually just enrolled in an MBA program and feel very untechy in trying to figure out how to navigate the online platforms and how to access my homework and make a discussion and turn in my grades, etc. What the familiarity is. So often when I do a Zoom, I'll even start with kind of the expectations of Zoom. So I said, like, you're going to be able to chat with the panelists, me. You can chat and other attendees can see it, but you don't have a participant list. I was able to explain that so that people don't have to spend time kind of trying to learn the platform. That's always a good idea. I also mentioned that I'll email out the slides so that people can have access to any of the images or the slides or the information afterwards to make print resources available. When I'm using my examples or if I'm going to call on people, so the webinar I just got off of, I wanted to know name pronunciation for words that I may not be familiar with. That's my limitation, not theirs. Socioeconomic class is the assumption that everybody has ring lights and all this very expensive equipment. I do not have that stuff. But also that what kind of nice clothing I'm wearing or what we're seeing in people's backgrounds. Lighting, language, and even just a history of the existing microaggressions and stories we have about each other around our racial identity and how we express that also show up in virtual meetings. The religious and political beliefs I talked about were, the holidays or cultural practices, but also home decorations that are behind us. a lot of us are kind of used to not being able to have certain personal things in our offices, but now our office walls have disappeared. And so in Zoom, there may be things that are related to my either politics or political practices, religious beliefs and practices that are visible on Zoom. Gender, what it means as far as who gets interrupted and who doesn't get interrupted, who takes notes, how we interpret engagement versus non-engagement. And then for sexual orientation, privacy, what's being disclosed about people's home life, what it means working from home, or even other partners that you may have and what their homework responsibilities are. So it's just an example of how the Big Eight isn't just relevant to meeting in person, but it is also relevant to online. I would also put this into Facebook groups or Slack channels or things that you're doing as well. So remember, the original question is, what can meetings and convention industry professionals do to be even more inclusive? Because that implies you're already trying to do a good job. So how can you go one step further? So without blowing your budget. So that includes virtual. Why not serve participants even better? So when I get to risk management, expectations, best practices, I've broken them down into particular areas. Some of them are relevant. Accommodations is obviously, we may think immediately of only in-person pieces, and I will be talking about roommates and hotel stays and things, but you can also be thinking about accommodations that you're doing virtually. So housing, roommate matches, bathroom, language, ride shares, mentor programs is where I usually just stop on this program. But you also need to be conscious about what devices people have, their internet access, what time zones are people in, what languages are they used to speaking or writing or typing in. Do you need subtitles or closed captioning? And is your virtual event going to be asynchronous or synchronous? When you're able to do that, then you're able to kind of gauge a little bit more what people's needs are going to be. So this is a really good platform for what kind of questions to ask in advance, and then you can determine what you can or cannot accommodate. Now, another theme is that I will help you identify questions you can ask, but once you've asked the questions, you also need to be able to do something with those answers. So if you can't do something with those answers, it's your responsibility to then reach back out and say, thank you very much for answering this question. Just so you know, this program is limited in this way and can only provide this. We cannot provide this, so that people know what they're working with. So a chat just came in. This is really good. Thank you. When people say they aren't turning on video because they are not camera ready, I get annoyed because I want people to feel comfortable just showing up. However, I know I need to be more patient and realize they may have other issues going on in their current living situation. Right. So what's important about not camera ready is the Zoom language for I'm not turning on my camera. It could mean all kinds of things. Maybe it means I'm having a bad hair day. Maybe it means that the person I'm caretaking for, either pre or post COVID, is visible and I don't have their consent for them to be on video and they're asleep. That's another reason to not turn on your video. So Joan's asking a question, will there be a transcript of the content of this available after the program to accompany the slides? Doesn't need to be answered now, just need to know. Ha ha, I answered it now anyway. Yes, the transcript, Zoom automatically does the transcript and I'm happy to provide it. It's not perfect, but it's better than nothing, so happy to. Okay, so let me kind of keep rolling real quick. So remembering the expectations and requirements, I am not a lawyer, so I am not giving you legal advice. But ultimately, I think a safe assumption is that we want people to feel safe and welcomed and included, which means we're going to need to find out how they don't feel safe, welcome, and included, which means we also need to be prepared to feel very defensive. We need to be prepared for like, oh, I'm not doing a good job. Well, you just asked me. You asked me, how am I doing? And I'm giving you feedback. So then kind of watch that and understand. Being able to have these conversations is super important because both people may very well be coming from a place of fear, and you can diffuse that fear by just asking a question and then finding out if you can or you cannot accommodate that and then letting people know. It's a really important thing and doesn't cost any money. I like to use the examples of back in the day when I got on airplanes. I was often in charge of gender neutral bathrooms in the convention centers or the hotels. And so what ended up happening is I'd have a conversation with the staff, with the meeting professional staff, the hotel staff, with the convention center staff, and give them some education about what gender neutral bathrooms mean. Sometimes I had to inform them what their state or local laws were and what this means, and I always provided my phone number. By doing that, if something were to happen, then in the moment of the thing that might be happening, they have educational tools and someone to help in that moment. I always think it's interesting that a great way to subside fear that hasn't happened yet is the anxiety that the fear could happen. So then if it does happen, what are we going to do? Well, if it does happen, here's my phone number. Here's a packet of information to give people. Here's some general information about what your state and local laws are, or what the non-discrimination policy is of this particular venue or this particular organization or this particular event. All we have to do is engage in the conversation. Then people feel like they have access to information. They're not being expected to be an expert on something they don't know. Same thing goes when I virtually host meetings. So I often can MC an event, I can DJ, kind of be in the background and just kind of hosting it on Zoom. And sometimes I'm also the person, like today, providing the content. So then I need to be able to know what are preferred names, pronouns, voice, how are people going to be accessing the information, giving people back. When I'm the MC or a DJ, whoever the contact is, they always have my direct cell phone number so that when I'm muted and in the background, I have the ability to communicate with them directly. We call it the back channel. So reducing fear helps, and it honestly takes about a 10-minute conversation. I have difficult conversations for a living, so I love these kind of things, and other people get very nervous about them. But I just want to make sure that you know that caring and listening is part of this conversation and has a significant impact on the ability for all people involved, virtually or in person, to feel welcomed and included. So whether we are socially distant or not, I'm going to go through some of these other things and then we'll take a break, and I'll check in for questions again at the end of this section. So for housing options, one of the things I think is important, and again, this isn't necessarily about ADA accommodations, but are there any? And if there are, could you let people know in advance what is available? Or can you provide a space for people to say, hey, I really would like this to be provided, and then you follow up if you can or you cannot provide that. When we start talking about what they can do, remember that they may be sharing information that is private to them, and they may be sharing information they have to talk about all the time, but it's always good to kind of ask and engage in a conversation about what they are interested in being shared with other people on the planning team. For roommate matching, a lot of times people get very nervous about the liability involved in this, and thank goodness for free social media channels. Because all you have to do there is say, go to this Facebook group that we created and see if people want a roommate. You're on your own. But at least you provided the connections and the ability to connect, and then they can figure out if they get along or they want a room together. Sometimes this accommodates class. Sometimes this also accommodates food needs. Or me, I'm a flaming extrovert. So if the conference is going to be really intense, I like to have a roommate to be able to kind of decompress the day before I fall asleep. Bathrooms, we talked a little bit about them for single-use bathrooms being clearly marked. And I think it's important to mention that in some places, this is not a legal activity to do. So you need to figure out as an organization, is this something that you need to do? Is this something that you want to do? And in other locations, this is something that is expected. And so when they're not there, it's very like, oh, well, that's strange. Why isn't this here? You may not even know if your participants need gender neutral bathrooms, or perhaps you're providing an educational space for people to learn about gender neutral bathrooms, but probably not asking. When I mentioned providing the planner's phone number, I think it's a really important piece that out of the professionals around the event, you can kind of either have one person up a day, so then I'm it. So if it's your day, that's your number that's being provided. I actually think a better practice is to have one person with a different area of specialty. So maybe someone's in charge of food or beverage, one person's in charge of accommodations, one person's in charge of like ASL interpreters or things. What's interesting to me is that even when we make the accommodation, we don't find out until the very end of the final survey if the accommodation worked or not. Well, if the food is terrible or the ASL interpreter is not doing a very good job, wouldn't you want to know that quickly? So now the person who said they need that accommodation, do they have a phone number they can call earlier than later to check in and say whether or not that accommodation is working? Virtual, same thing. This is kind of the back channel. Also, I usually give any organization that I'm hosting their meeting, they give me all the handouts and stuff in advance so that if something happens on their end, I can jump in. And then I usually do that as well if I'm providing the content, especially virtually. Languages, making sure that you are mirroring the language that the professionals and participants are using to describe themselves, but that you also are open to other words or descriptions that you may not have been expecting. This also means additional languages. The webinar I did this morning was for a city's rec center, and one of the questions they ask is, what's your primary language? But they never asked on the application or the waiver forms, what other languages do you speak or write in or use on a regular basis? And by getting that information, you could actually pull together people who use similar languages, either for translation services or whether you're talking about translation of documents or in a conversation. But also when you have to call someone or reach back out, now you have the information about what their preferred languages may be. But you just have to ask. That goes back to mirroring language as well. Okay. Closed captioning, subtitles, like Joan mentioned, having a transcript available can also be helpful. If you're in a Zoom meeting, giving everyone the opportunity to rename themselves however they like is also helpful. Same thing goes with the preferences on name tags as how we are labeling our faces on Zoom. Ride shares usually is kind of another liability thing that would come up. And it's another great space for, like, if you're interested in carpooling to this event or need to carpool to this event, here's another social media channel. You're kind of on your own, but then you get to kind of check in and see who could need help with that. Same thing may go with Zoom. It sounds like a strange thing to compare that to ride sharing, but maybe people don't have access to the technology or the internet. And so maybe there's somebody else that lives close by that they could socially distance but participate in the online event at the same time. Mentor programs, I think, are a really great thing to do in person and virtually. And I usually recommend that mentor programs have at least 5 people per group. Most of the time, they're 2 people, but what if they don't gel or click? If they're 5 people, then there's a possibility that you'll be able to click with more people or at least one person. For virtual mentor peer groups, I recommend that people be in the same time zone so that it's a lot easier to do doodles or set up Zoom calls or something like that. And they have a better chance of connecting with each other. And then if and when you do happy hours, whether those are virtual or in person, then you can actually do that by region or by time zone as well, so people get to know other people. This is a great way also for the higher leadership or the newer members to also engage what on a university campus we call the sophomore slumps. So we pay attention to seniors and we pay attention to first years. But for an association, there's people who maybe aren't brand new, but maybe they took a year off or 2 and now they're back, but they're not quite leaders yet. That middle group is a really great untapped resource that can also help them feel more included and welcomed, even in virtual groups, because now they have a job and a task. And in groups of 5, no one is necessarily the leader of the group, and they can have different levels of experiences. So when looking at upcoming legislation, it's important to know that every election cycle, whether we're talking about a city, a state, or on a federal level, things can change. So paying attention. To kind of move into some other pieces that are often coming up around accommodations now, depending in different areas. A lot of these examples are going to be from in-person meetings. So, but it's also important for you to think futuristically about either your venues or how you are utilizing those venues. So an example that I thought was really helpful, and this is from a conference that I had attended, but in the back of the room was a basket of blankets, and the blankets were actually sponsored by an organization. So if you were chilly in the room, you could grab a blanket. If you wanted to, you could return the blanket, and the hotel actually cleaned and laundered the blankets at night. Most of the blankets were probably stolen by the end of the event, but that's really good news for the sponsor. And in the meantime, when you get cold, this might help. Same thing goes with this sign in the back of a chair that just says this one is underneath the AC vent. Some people, like myself, often have my own personal summer, regardless of what winter it is. So that would be my favorite chair. And thank you for labeling it for me. If you are a really cold person, that would not be your favorite chair, but now you know. And that's what I mean by thinking in advance. So even during this period of time where we're not meeting in person, you can very clearly be thinking about the venues that you have and what could you be doing inside that venue to be more accommodating just by letting information be known. Food allergies, also not my super strength. I always recommend Tracy Stuckrath here. But a lot of things that are happening around food allergies and beverages are also following into ADA accommodations. Some of you are so excited that it's all virtual meetings that you don't have to deal with this anymore. But I invite you to take this occasion to think about how you are asking for this. It is also a great practice to connect everyone together who have food and beverage related issues, create a group for them to be able to talk and exchange practices. It's also a really great group that you could give a menu in advance to. So I know meeting professionals, you're planning the menus 2 years in advance. Why not get some assistance with the people who are planning the menus? And ultimately, food and beverage is about the equal nourishment of your attendees. That's about inclusion and being welcoming. So the example that I like to use when I was at an event was a planner had spent extra money training a venue's kitchen on cooking kosher breakfasts. All the meals were kosher. And she was very upset because the kosher breakfast cost $26 a breakfast. And that one particular member who needed that kosher breakfast never came to breakfast. And she was wasting her money. So I asked the meeting professional, I said, does this participant eat breakfast? And the meeting professional was like, I don't know. And I was like, well, it seems that maybe the participant doesn't. So why don't you ask? Well, it turns out that this participant is a night owl and never eats breakfast. So the meeting professional adjusted and sent a $5 snack at midnight to the room, saved a ton of money, stopped all the breakfasts because it's a 6-day event, and the participant felt really included because their night owlness was also a kosher snack. It's not hard, you just have to know which questions to ask. So, prayer and religious practices, I think it's a really important thing to be able first to notice the dates of any of the events that you are doing. Are there any religious practices or holidays or things that are occurring around that time? And do any of your anticipated users or participants practice that religious practice? And if so, what do you need to do? If you don't know, great, ask. If your event is always October 3rd, you don't have to change it. You just have to know what else is October 3rd. It's a very important thing to know, and we don't often ask. Um, Another comment came in, and we need to allow people to participate in a way that's most comfortable. Yeah, absolutely. It's also important to be able to ask for particular venues. I've started seeing this in some of the hotels I was in. So this is a window, an arrow in the ceilings. It's just a sticker. I've also seen rugs being included in the closet of hotels. Those rugs could be used for prayer, which is what this is pointing in the direction of, because if you haven't left the hotel in days, you may not remember the direction of Mecca. But those rugs can also be used for exercise or yoga in the room. So there's a lot of different purposes for it. This could be a great thing to do while hotels are only being able to accommodate every 4 rooms, every other floor with a 72-hour gap. While you have that advantage, these are kind of some upgrades or accommodations you could do during the slower period. Scent sensitivities, I think is a really important thing, is that when you ask about people's allergies and you find out that there is a scent sensitivity, then that means in advance, the hotel or the venue or the convention center, etc., needs to be really mindful of the cleaning supplies that they are using. It is possible that you actually need to put a message out to everyone who is attending the event in person that scents are not allowed. There was an event recently that someone was deathly allergic to apples. And even though there was no apples in the food and the participants were told, never, don't bring anything apples, don't bring anything that smells like apples, One of the bowls that held oranges and bananas only for breakfast had apples in it and hadn't been cleaned properly, and the person ended up having an allergic reaction to the apples that used to be in the bowl. So it's not your place to know how severe someone's accommodation needs to be. It's your place to ask what accommodations need to happen and then report back out what you are able to do. And of course, something could still happen, and then don't get defensive about it. If you're being inclusive and welcoming, then you need to be prepared for when you're being told you're not being inclusive and welcoming, and then go from there. That's the agreement between the professional and the participant. Neurotypical or atypical. I've seen in person people having kind of busy hands. This is often sometimes seen as a distraction or that they're not paying attention. Sometimes medication also really needs you to have kind of busy hands. So allow for those things to happen if people need them. Low light, quiet spaces, different textures. This can also show up in the virtual world around muting video, sharing music, or having too much biz bang zigzags going on, flash on websites or transitions on PowerPoint slides. All of these things are really important to know that it could be very upsetting or actually hurtful to one of your users, and you may not know that because you haven't asked. This is actually a sandbox that I had at a recent event where people found the texture of sand very soothing, so it was made available for folks. This is a kind of low stimulus space that was also available at a conference specifically around autism. Service and support animals. I am fascinated to see where this is going to come specifically kind of post COVID when we get back together. Because there's all different kinds of local, state, and federal legislation around what is a service and what is a support animal and what is or isn't present. I just Googled and this chart came up, so I recommend you doing your own work. But it is also a great opportunity to be able to communicate if you have users who have service animals or support animals that when we do meet in person again, they may get to meet, or they may be with them on the Zoom. You can do this in a get to know a member now, introduce the animal and introduce the participant so that people become familiar with the person with their service or support animal. You can do that now. Local customization, here's just some kind of general examples that I found, but Chick-fil-A is a very interesting company to me, in that one of the things that I really respect about Chick-fil-A is that they are not open on Sundays because it goes against the business owner's religious beliefs. Now, what is important to know is that often if you are near a venue that has a Chick-fil-A, and let's pretend that we're not sheltering in place, it is seen as the less expensive food venue close by, but you need to be conscious that that's not open on Sunday. So same thing goes when there's venues that might be open during the day because you're in a downtown kind of urban area or something like that. Someday we will be back into all of these little restaurants, but they may not be open on weekends or at night. So being mindful of when things are available and when they are not available and adjusting to the local area is a really important piece. This came out of San Francisco's BART, or public transportation. So the sign says, "Attention BART riders, racism, sexism, Islamophobia, homophobia, transphobia, and xenophobia are prohibited in the BART system at all times. Get your shit together." So this is a publicly posted sign, but there are parts of the country where having the shit word on a public sign would be very offensive. Even me just reading it aloud, some of you were like, you're not supposed to cuss. So is that cussing or is that not cussing varies by region and person's subjectivity. But I also want to draw attention to some people don't know what these words mean, and some people do know what these words mean, but it's up to you to know who your users are. So I think that that's a really important piece to be able to understand when you're actually developing your signage. It might be accommodating to most of your members, but then you're also going to need to provide some education for people who may not know those words. So it's an awesome sign that we need everywhere today. I would agree, except I think it needs some definitions or maybe a little pamphlet or something that goes along with it. We knew there would be an attendee with a service dog, but we didn't realize the doors of the convention center would open from the inside, but not let the participant back inside from the side of the building if she took the dog outside to relieve itself. Right. So where's that dog going to pee? That's a good thing to know. Why make them have to figure that out? You can partner with them. Um, the concept we need to have in hotels and for meetings. Yes, great. Good job, Joan. Okay, so then I'm going to keep traveling. So I used to be in airports a bunch. So this sign was near TSA that was specifically about hunters. Now, depending on where you are or potentially what kind of event this may or may not be relevant to hunters. And I grew up in a family of hunters, but it was fascinating to me this local customization that might be relevant. Um, Same thing goes, double check, make sure you don't have your guns with you. In some places, I don't know that this would be necessary, and in other places, this might be necessary. So, depending on what you're doing, your next in person event, why not use this time to have a conversation about how do you feel about concealed and carry laws on your local level while your event is in that local place? How do you feel about people brandishing their weapons? Technically speaking, that is illegal, but there are also open carry laws in other places. What's the difference between open carry and brandish, and how does that impact your in-person events? What a good time to have that a conversation now instead of having it when you need it. This little gizmo, some of you may be very familiar with this, but this little gizmo, it was at TSA to help you get your boots off. Also, local customization, right? So the TSA there noticed what kind of shoes wear people were wearing, and then they bought these little boot getter offers because the people who were going through TSA needed them. If TSA can do local customization, I'm just saying that meeting professionals probably can too, but we need to know what questions we need to be asking. So hopefully this is some just basic helpful information, but it's important to be able to understand who your users are, again, the intended users, who are the unintentional users that are there, and do they have any needs that need to be accommodated, and who are you excluding from the event because you cannot accommodate those needs or because they're not actually welcome or included in the event. Maybe they're not paying members, maybe they didn't pay the registration fee. I don't know. Who are you excluding? Who are you including? And the people in the middle, what can you do to accommodate them and make them feel more welcome? So if you can remember to ask them what it is they need, remember the key is to ask these kind of very specific targeted questions, actually gather the information and engage in a conversation with them about what you can and you cannot accommodate. That's a really important piece. This particular cartoon, I'll describe it for people who may not be able to see the image, but I think what's really important about this cartoon is this is a rhinoceros that is an artist is painting, and is currently painting an elephant in a kind of laid back, casual position. And what's interesting is on the back of the wall are all the other paintings the rhinoceros has painted. And you'll notice in all of the paintings, the rhinoceros's horn is showing up because the horn is in the way of the view of what the rhinoceros is trying to paint. And this is actually the key understanding in doing diversity and inclusion work regardless of the laws, is that you need to know who you are and get your own identity square so that you can figure out what your conscious and unconscious biases are and then begin to ask the questions to other people to find out how you can accommodate them. It'll help with your defensiveness, but it'll also help with their defensiveness because you have to get out of your own way. If you can get out of your own way, you'll be able to ask them better questions and engage in more authentic conversations and be more generous because you were curious in the first place about how they and you can have an authentic experience. So I know that that's a relatively quick kind of run through of the event, but I wanted to make sure that you had a wide variety of things to think about and look at first. And then I wanted to be able to kind of open it up to a larger conversation that you may be having. So now is your chance. Dun, dun, dun. So feel free to put some comments in the chat or feel free to put questions in the Q&A, and I'll also be checking my text messages now. But if that is the general kind of overview, then I'm fascinated to find out what kind of thoughts you may have or what kind of personal accommodation situations you've had to see if maybe I can help. So I'll put the texting number again in the chat room because I don't have any texts that have come in. And Joan, I think you said you tried to text me. Maybe I misunderstood. 202 670 4262 is the texting number. Feel free to text any kind of question and I'll read them aloud now and try and give you some one-on-one accommodations. And then for the Q&A, I think I've addressed the two that had come in. Let's see if there's anything else that happens. Thoughts, comments? Here's one. So are you addressing directly the issue for now for how much of this? I heard a great idea for Pride Month for Zoom meetings, especially for companies. Joan, I don't think I understand your question. Maybe you can re-clarify or feel free to put it into the chat to everyone. Great. I still don't have any text messages. I will be emailing everybody out an assessment that you can use to kind of look into your own organization to kind of begin these kind of internal conversations. And then obviously I'm available to help with anything that I can. For those of you, I want to be respectful of the solid hour just in case, but if you are interested in the CMP credits, or I would also invite you, if you don't need the credits, but you can still give me your name and email address, I'm more than happy to follow up with you with the slides, and the handout and any other additional information. I will also be sending that out to everyone who registered for the webinar, but I wanted to make sure that this survey was available for the people who specifically need the CMP points. So, oh good, Joan, you gave me a clarification, meaning non-physical meetings versus physical meetings. Are you addressing directly the issue of non-virtual meetings for much of this? I tried to do a balance between physical meetings and virtual meetings. I attempted to do that. I'm actually, as far as Pride Month for Zoom meetings goes, I'm actually doing a keynote on Thursday for the LGBT employee resource group for a company. They're pulling in a global group of people together across, I think they're using WebEx as the platform, and then I'm delivering about a 40-minute keynote with about 10 or 15-minute questions coming in from social media, Facebook Live, my texting, as well as the Q&A or chat function within WebEx. And then I'll close it out with kind of a closing story. Great information and presentation. I'm interested in the replay for a DG friend who is a meeting planner and couldn't attend. Oh, great. I'll also be making the recording available. Sure, too. Is this DG as in Delta Gamma? Hello, sorority sister. Looking forward to the handouts. Thank you, Jess. Impressive presentation and excellent content. Thank you very much. I love waking up to compliments. Joan, the Pride idea is for an all company staff meeting digitally. The planner got a list of all the LGBT plus restaurants that deliver, and gift certificates were sent to use to get food from there so that people would have and support the purpose. Oh, that's really great. I know that my husband is the union rep for where he works, and they used DoorDash recently and delivered a cocktail to everyone who was in the union meeting, and they all did a cheers when they all turned their grades in. So that was kind of fun. Yeah, there's a lot of creativity that we can do as far as engagement and interaction and things like that. I think it's a really important piece to know that you don't have to be wildly creative. This really is not a huge pivot. And I know that that sounds probably counterintuitive, but I think what is interesting is that it's just the, I don't know, it's just the fact, right? Like I've been doing virtual events, virtual content, webinars, trainings, mediated conversations, facilitated conversations for a decade or more, and it's all in there. We're just now being told we can't do the other thing. So then there's some like, oh, we can't do the other thing. What do we want to do? What's going to happen? What are we going to be? And the reality is that it's an interesting time to be creative together, right? So I was on a call yesterday and we were talking about, I used to have a DVD product, if you can remember DVDs. And so one of the things I did in the DVD was I gave the people expectation, like, please hit pause now. and so that they could go have a conversation, right? So hit pause on the DVD and go have a conversation. Well, like any defensive driving class or something, you're not going to hit pause. You're like, let's go, let's get it through. So in the DVD, I built in a timer, and the timer, because of the DVD technology at the time, you couldn't fast forward. So I told you to hit pause, but you didn't. So now here is the timer. And then what I thought was really cool is that it allowed interaction even though I wasn't there on the DVD platform. So the same thing can happen on the webinar. So I have been yakking at you for about an hour, but you had text messages, Q&A, and chat to be able to interact with me. And because of the settings in Zoom, I could have set it up to where you could have interacted with each other. I purposely didn't do that just so that I don't have wingmen right now doing all the chat. It's all me. So I had my phone, my Q&A, and my chat. So I limited that so that I could keep track of the different ideas because I know what I can do, right? So that works out great. Other thoughts, comments, any specific examples that people need assistance with or anything that we can help with? Let's see, I'm checking my text to see if anything came in. Doesn't look like it. Let me check again. I have to refresh, right? All right. Well, I highly recommend if there's anything that I can do to feel free, message me, talk. I am home. I'm not traveling anywhere. So if I can help in some way, feel free to text message. The number again is 202-670-4262. You can use that now or forever because at some point in time you'll have a question. Drop me an email, whatever I can do to help. I think it's important that we take advantage of the time that we have right now to really figure out what we can do to be more inclusive and more welcoming, be able to kind of do our own self-reflection to become a little less defensive so that we can do better work for others. So thank you very much for attending. If there's anything else I can do, just let me know. Thank you very much.